History often begins with a sound that feels decisive. A gunshot, declaration, or market crash. But power rarely moves at the speed of noise. It moves slowly through habits, contracts, expectations, and quiet fears that accumulate long before anyone admits they exist. By the time something explodes into view, the real decisions have already been made, and the outcome is often locked in. The First World War is usually taught as one of those sudden moments, a world sleepwalking into catastrophe. Yet, if you listen carefully, beneath the echoes of Sarajevo, you can hear a much older tension humming, steady and mechanical, like steel under strain. At the start of the 20th century, the world was not divided primarily by ideologies or even borders, but by access. Access to markets, to resources, to movement. Britain's power did not rest on how much it produced, but on how effectively it could decide who moved, where, and at what cost. Sea lanes were its true territory, and the oceans were policed not simply by ships, but by insurance rates, port permissions, and financial trust. The empire was less a nation than a system, one that rewarded compliance and punished independence without always firing a shot. Germany entered this system late, highly capable but structurally constrained. Its factories were efficient, its scientists innovative, its workforce disciplined, yet its economic life depended on pathways controlled by others. Every cargo that crossed an ocean did so under British naval dominance, and every detour carried risk. For a rising power, this dependence was not merely inconvenient, it was existential. Wealth without secure circulation is fragile, and German planners understood that prosperity could evaporate the moment access was denied. Far to the southeast, the Ottoman Empire faced a different version of the same problem. Its weakness was not industrial, but financial. Years of borrowing had transformed sovereignty into paperwork, with revenue streams pledged long before taxes were collected. Decisions about salt, tobacco, and rail tariffs were no longer domestic matters. They were questions for distant creditors. The empire still ruled vast lands, but its freedom to act had been quietly mortgaged. Modernization was discussed endlessly, yet every serious proposal required approval from the very powers that benefited from Ottoman stagnation. When German capital and Ottoman desperation found each other, it looked on the surface like cooperation. In reality, it was a convergence of fears. A railway stretching from Central Europe toward the Persian Gulf promised something both sides lacked: autonomy. Not dominance, not conquest, but the ability to move goods, troops, and energy without asking permission from a naval empire. Steel tracks offered a different geometry of power, one that ignored coastlines and reduced fleets to spectators. What made this idea dangerous was not its novelty, but its logic. An overland corridor would shift incentives everywhere it passed. Ports would lose leverage, insurers would lose influence, and middlemen who thrived on choke points would see their margins shrink. Control would move inland, away from admirals and bankers who had grown accustomed to being indispensable. For an empire built on intermediation, this was an unacceptable future. Opposition did not announce itself as fear. It arrived as concern, as caution, as responsible skepticism. Questions were raised about stability, about governance, about whether certain regions were ready for such connectivity. Financial participation was withheld under the guise of prudence. Local leaders were encouraged to sign agreements that seemed protective but quietly closed doors. None of this required armies. It required patience and credibility, the ability to make obstruction feel like common sense. As the railway advanced in fragments, so did anxiety. Its slow progress was itself a source of instability, creating half-finished dependencies and strategic ambiguity. The Ottomans bet that time would work in their favor, that completion would restore balance. But incomplete systems are often more dangerous than finished ones. They promise relief while delivering vulnerability, and when pressure mounts, they fail at the worst possible moment. War did not erupt because of a single assassination. It emerged from a landscape where too many actors believed that delay was more dangerous than action. Once fighting began, priorities clarified quickly. Armies marched not only toward capitals, but toward resources and corridors. Campaigns in deserts and mountains were not sideshows. They were attempts to secure flows that would define the post-war order. Oil, still new as a strategic obsession, revealed its importance precisely because it was scarce and unevenly distributed. When borders were later drawn, they followed incentives more closely than identities. Lines were placed to fracture continuity, to ensure that no single route could be controlled end-to-end by a rival power. Economic unity was treated as a threat, fragmentation as stability. The railway's promise was neutralized, not by destroying tracks, but by surrounding them with incompatible administrations, tariffs, and currencies. Movement remained possible, but coordination became expensive and slow. What followed was a century of managing the consequences. Pipelines replaced railways, quieter and easier to guard. Control shifted again, from visible infrastructure to invisible agreements. Local populations lived atop wealth they did not direct, while external powers refined methods of influence that relied less on rule and more on alignment. The language changed, but the structure endured. The pattern is not confined to the past. Whenever a new connection threatens to reduce dependence on an existing system, it attracts scrutiny framed as moral concern or financial responsibility. Infrastructure is never just concrete and steel. It is a bet on who will be trusted tomorrow. Nations that accept help are rarely told that they are also accepting the rivalries that come with it. Choice narrows quietly until neutrality itself becomes impossible. The deeper lesson of the unfinished railway is not about Germany or the Ottomans, but about belief. People believed that technology could outrun politics, that efficiency could neutralize power. They believed that access, once built, would remain open. Yet systems endure not because they are efficient, but because enough people depend on them to fear their collapse. When those systems feel threatened, they respond not emotionally, but systematically. Money, at its core, is an agreement about the future. So is infrastructure. When the two align, they create stability. When they clash, they expose whose future is being prioritized. The tracks that never fully connected Europe to the Middle East remind us that the most important forces in history often operate quietly, shaping choices long before consequences are visible. If you want to continue exploring how power, trust, and money shape the world beneath the surface of events, you're welcome to subscribe for more stories like this.